morning, and welcome to the panel on evaluation approaches for assessing integrated environmental and socio-economic co-benefits. My name is Carlo Carugi. I work for the GEF Independent Evaluation Office, and I will be chair this session. We have 4 panelists: Andy Rowe, Taka Miyaguchi, Callum Murdoch, and Joe Puri. We'll introduce them later. The focus of the panel is on how best to approach the socio-economic and environmental nexus from an evaluation point of view in today's SDG context. Every one of our panelists will have 15 minutes to present. Then this will be followed by eventual questions for clarifications, and then we will run a QA session at the end of the panel. So let's get started. Before the first presenter is Andy. Let me introduce him. Andy is a former president of the Canadian Evaluation Society. He has a PhD from the London School of Economics, and he has worked in universities with government, private ocean research corporation, and globally as a consultant. Andy is a member of a technical evaluation reference group of the Climate Adaptation Fund. He's on the board of EcoTrust Canada and associate editor of the journal Evaluation and Program Planning. Through consulting assignment, research, publications, and conference presentations, Andy is a leading contributor to evaluation of sustainability and climate change, and to evaluation of conflict resolution. Recent publications have appeared in the American Journal of Evaluation, New Direction in Evaluation, and Evaluation and in Book chapters. Andy, in his presentation, will introduce a provocative call for attention to the fact that while the SDGs have brought the social, economic, and environmental closer to each other, they still treat them as separable, which does not bode well for the presentation. So let me give the floor to Andy for his contribution.
Speak from here or there?
You have let's load the presentation.
That will do the slide. Can you get the presentation up?
Sure.
Thank you all very much for being here. Could I have a 7-minute warning in addition to the 5, please? 5, there's no time to adapt. 7, you get a little more flexibility. My argument, which is about to come up on the slide, but I'll make sure that I get it right, basically starts from observations that we've made and a premise that evaluation shows very little interest in natural systems. Now that sounds a bit odd in a conference like this, which is full of climate and natural systems, but we're almost totally the universe in the world. There aren't that many more people outside of us. I mean, maybe 4 or 5 times our number. The size, our population is about the size of a modest-sized interest group in some arcane area of education in the United States at American Evaluation Association. So that we don't have that much of a presence. Most of it is in international. So I can't see the slides from here.
Why don't you sit here? You have it right in front of you.
Yeah, no, I'm going to stand up.
Yeah, whatever you want. Whatever fits you better.
And this goes this way.
Yeah.
And that's there.
It works?
No, we'll get there though. So, in order to think about, I mean, the end point for me is that evaluation is dealing with coupled human and natural systems. That's what ecology tells us. That's what we understand when we talk about complex systems and all the dynamic, nonlinear threshold and all the other stuff that goes on with their interaction or their transaction. But Juha and others have written about a nexus point. And I think of a nexus point as we recognize and we address the human systems and the natural systems and how they bump up against each other, how they start to influence each other, but we're not going into the full complex analysis. And the message I want to add to evaluation shows very little interest in natural systems, period, is that we urgently need to get to nexus systems so that every evaluation, regardless of its origin, whether it's a social program, a humanitarian program, or a climate or natural resource program, needs to consider both systems. The evaluation has to function at the nexus, because we know the SDGs are connected. We know that human and natural systems are connected. So as long as evaluation is here, we're not very important. In fact, what we're doing, if we stay here and we just look at human systems, or primarily at human systems, then we're not addressing sustainability, because you have to have natural systems there to be addressing sustainability. And if we're not addressing sustainability, then we're not addressing the major issue of today, which is extinction. And people will see that, oh, evaluation isn't interested in helping us avoid extinction. It isn't interested in us at addressing equity, because equity is about both systems together. And an evaluation function that it doesn't even show the remotest interest in addressing the major issues of today will soon be extinct itself. So this isn't just a personal issue. People often say to me, that's a personal choice whether we do that or not. It isn't. It's about it's a professional issue, and it has to do with the survival of the field. Now, the Canadian Evaluation Society has been moving very rapidly and is the first evaluation society, first VOPE in the world, to introduce sustainability, and let's call it briefly as equity issues, which has to do with indigenous culture diversity, as cross-cutting themes in the strategic plan. What that means is that everything that the Canadian Evaluation Society does must incorporate equity and sustainability. So all of the training, Canadian Evaluation Society has the first certification program for evaluators. Certification process has to be adapted to incorporate these two. We've already started on Indigenous, and we'll soon start on sustainability. And so we have a new threshold. We've crossed the threshold. So the Canadian Evaluation Society is saying, Evaluation Canada needs to move to the nexus. And it's our job to promote that, advocate for that, provide the resourcing and support for doing that. So what did we do? We convened something called the Sustainability Working Group. Sustainability Working Group looked at two things, greening CES, but also conducting a stock taking. The stock taking looked at 4 areas. They're up there. One of the areas was Government of Canada evaluations. As many of you probably know, Canada has a national evaluation policy and has had one for about 20 years, so that every program, strategy, policy that is material, that is roughly over $5 million budget, has to be evaluated at least once in a 5-year cycle. And what we found when we reviewed those evaluations conducted over the last 2 years is that natural resources were totally missing. In those evaluations, we were, and this is stretching the point to the extreme, but we're sort of asymptotic to zero, we could not find consideration of the natural system. Even in natural resource departments, Department of Natural Resources, because to them, natural resources are for extraction and use for employment and commercial purposes. So that the focus of evaluation of those departments was on their commercial use, not on anything to do with conservation. The exception was Global Affairs Canada, who we think, because of 2030 and other conventions that Canada signed on to, has included the natural system. We did find that the glimmer of hope is really in the multilateral agencies that are responsible for the environment. So the GEF, IEO, UNEP, and other organizations, they look at both systems increasingly, not universally, not widespread, and we'd invite you to actually do a systematic, I think it's time for UNEG to do a systematic review of this. But in our first glimpse, that appears to be the case, and it's consistent with Global Affairs Canada. The other thing we observed, and this is very sobering, is that there is hardly any intellectual infrastructure within the evaluation frame for looking at natural systems. There's on average in the United States, in the American journals, 1 paper per year in all the journals that mentions, that is focused on the natural systems. And sometimes they're rather weak focus. There'll be an agricultural extension paper or something like that. So there isn't really, if we look at conference presentations, if we look at the gray literature, we look for guidance, we look for faculty positions in programs, they're all missing in North America. Because we're in Canada, we stopped our scope because we think we've got enough to move on. We can say it's not there, we're going to have to do something about this. So our task, good, that's better than I thought. Our task is to move from that, and I love that it's snow and not sand, to be useful for this. I mean, if we're going to be relevant, we have to be useful for that. Not necessarily those people, but including those people. Anyone want to debate that? We could, though. But to get there, to get to where we need to go to coupled systems, and recognizing that we don't have the intellectual infrastructure, we have to go through the Nexus. We have to go through the Nexus system. We have to get to the Nexus and have all evaluation conducted on the Nexus. And my sense, my premise, my belief, and what I will argue strongly, is that the development of methods and techniques and adaptation of our worldviews will come through experience, through doing evaluations, trying to evaluate the Nexus, encountering the problems and solving, or at least addressing those problems, and then sharing them. It will not come from academics sitting in institutions telling us what to do. Because the global oversight, massive, this is guidance that they tend to produce, cannot address the complexity and the diversity of settings in which we conduct evaluations. And if we're adding both systems in, then the complexity and the diversity of those settings is going to be geometrically increased. They're complex and diverse just with the human system. You add the natural system, many more times so. So we need to learn from doing, we need to share that learning, and we need to think about it, we need to reflect on it. This is going to require a different institutional structure than the institutional structure that evaluation has. We tend to have people who are placed in academic institutions and in think tanks and that sort of stuff, who are producing guidance for us and etc. If we're going to work from the bottom up, practitioners, the commissioning organizations and the evaluators who are working on the evaluations do not have the time or the capacity or the institutional structure to do that reflection. We need to address that as a serious problem. So one of the things, and I presented this argument in a paper that came out earlier this year, I'm really saying we don't have any problem with the technical tools to get started at the Nexus. The reason we're not doing it is social and political and has to do with our worldview. That's the only reason we have for it. So it's important for us to understand our worldview. We come from, if we look at the roots, and I'll show that slide in a minute, if we look at the roots of evaluation, it's said that we come from social inquiry, accountability, social accountability, and that sort of stuff. I propose to you that Western social science is thoroughly imbued with a world outlook, with a worldview that is based in dominion. Dominion as a worldview that says we have title, ownership, and control over everything else, all other peoples, all other things. That was the worldview that fueled colonialism It fueled Roman expansion many centuries before. But in Western social science, it is alive and well. In Western policy basis, it's alive and well. Why do you think we don't put any value on air or on water or on different species that become extinct or removed from the actions we take? It's because we don't think they're important. We don't value them. Why do you think we could do slavery? It's because we didn't value people of a different color. Why do you think it was possible to come to North America and decimate the populations that were there? It's because we didn't put any value on it. And the churches and the teaching all gave us the authorities. They all aligned behind that. So we have another issue with it, because the foundations of of our science, of our approach, is rooted in dominion. And that's going to be a challenge, because many of us believe and embrace those methods, and it's hard to be critical of them. Another point is that if we're going to deal with natural systems, we have to welcome into evaluation and figure out how to get them in the biophysical sciences. And social science and biophysical sciences do not speak a common language. They don't have a common belief system. Our methods are different. Now, we know how to fix this, and the lessons are in conflict resolution. When you look at conflict resolution used in complex disputes and how they bring their different worldviews together and their different positions and the different sciences, it's all there. We can bring in conflict resolution people to help us do it. And we'll need the help to bring in these different sciences and worldviews. But the point is that everything already exists to be able to evaluate at the Nexus. The only thing that doesn't exist is a functionality and use of clickers. Good. So here's our worldview. I mean, here's the people who say this is who we are. It's got the evaluation tree. And I write that the rootstock of evaluation has the terroir. That's what gives wine taste. It's the ground it grows in, as the terroir of dominion. And dominion doesn't taste very good to most people and species around the world. It only tastes good to Western social scientists and other people that we nominally serve. I was going to go on and talk more, but I cut it out of the presentation about SDG capture by agencies. But I just want to mention that because I was sort of on the periphery of people negotiating around a couple of the agencies around the SDGs. And there was a real quest, particularly by UN agencies, to capture an SDG. And perfectly understandable. You know, you couldn't do anything but support it, because with it came authority, came funding, came permission, all kinds of stuff. The agency would not be able to function without a claim to an SDG. But once they got their claim, they should share the claims. They should say, well, there are other claims. And what the Nexus says is everything is founded on a platform or the basis of the natural system SDGs, environment SDGs, let's say water, etc. So that's where we need to go. The question is, how are we going to get there? There's going to be fights. There's going to be some business as usual, because there's a lot of vested interest. My suggestion is we don't fight. If they're not interested, they'll come along. The mechanism of change is all those people on the streets, all the literature and all the knowledge about extinction and climate. They'll come along. Let's just be patient. Let's not waste our energies fighting. Let's just take whoever is there and let's go do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Andy. Any question? We have 1 minute for if there are any questions for clarification. 1 minute. 1 or 2 questions, please. Introduce yourself.
Hi, Sara Farina, evaluation consultant and president of the Canadian Evaluation Society. Andy, thank you for your presentation. Yesterday I was at a presentation about gender and the SDGs, and so I was asking how was the impact for gender around the SDGs, and one of the responses was that actually the unit of measure for SDGs is not often a human. And so when you talk about this nexus and you say, okay, let's say you're measuring land mass, you can't just tell land to have a bigger mass. So if you can just kind of just talk about what the measures look like.
Maybe we take another one on the phone. Just quickly introduce yourself.
If you could just explain a bit, how do you perceive that fifth P of prosperity in SDGs? Because my problem with SDGs is really that there is enrooted that leading story of economic growth in the SDG 8, which is really disrupting because it leads our societies, and I think it disrupts Nexus as well.
To Serena's question, I think there are a couple of things. I think it's absolutely right. The SDGs don't go far enough, but that's our job as evaluators. And it's program people's job to do that. And if the program people haven't done it, it's our job to take them there. So I recognize that, but I think we, as we're aware of that and we're committed to that. But the real problem is separating gender from environment, because women and children are most affected by environmental degradation. As the environment declines, they're going to be more and more at risk. They're going to be going further, gathering water, all that stuff you know. So it's the lack of combination, but not losing the granularity, I forget that word, in doing so. So I agree with you, and when I say all hands on board, yes, we have to do it that way. Yes, we have to do it that way. Let's figure it out. So that goes to your question, and I want to come back to that because there's another point in that. But the issue is really fundamentally development versus extinction. And development SDGs versus extinction SDGs. And this is unavoidable, but I've evaluated over 500 complex environmental disputes in the United States, individually. And they all went through a conflict resolution process, lasting from anywhere from a few weeks to, well, our longest running one is 10 years and still counting. It keeps reopening. And there, in the United States, where you're talking about environmental disputes, it's fundamentally about growth and development and enrichment and capture versus clean air and clean water and people. And the dispute resolution processes, a good facilitator, manages that tension. The problem is, in the land grab for the SDGs, we didn't have any facilitators managing the terrain. We could still have facilitators managing the terrain. But if we're going to evaluate at the Nexus, if it's the first time you're evaluating at the Nexus, first time you're bringing in biophysical scientists and indigenous worldviews and all of that, it'd be a good idea to have a facilitator there, because you're going to have the type of clash you're talking about. What I'm saying is the clash isn't the end point. It just means that we need to adapt to be doing that. So coming back to Sarah's saying, there's a phrase we don't use in evaluation, which is stance. What is the stance of the evaluator? What is it that they're looking at? We call it the evaluand, but the evaluand says it's them. The stance is us. We're the ones who are making the decision about where we put the frame. And to evaluate the Nexus, we have to do two things. We should use, we have a lot of differences between human and natural systems. One of the important ones to consider is scale, temporal and spatial scales. Temporal scales, I suggest we move to the 7-generation concept of indigenous peoples. You can, 7 generations, here I am in the middle. I can reach backwards 3 generations to my great-grandparents. I can reach forward 3 generations to my great-grandchildren. And that's the temporal scale we should use, not the temporal scale of the intervention. And to do that, and with the spatial scales, we have to do the same thing. We have to make sure that we don't punish the intervention for opening up the scale. So we say, here's your scale, here's the scale we're evaluating. Spatial scales I'm going to be very quick. There's two types of interests that should be. Look, the battery's out. I thought it was a way of cutting me off. That's my paranoia. Let me just finish on this one sentence. There are two types of interests that should be involved and considered in everything we do. Those who can affect success of the intervention and those who are affected by the intervention. And by those, I mean all people and species. And if our stance is all affected and all affecting and 7 generations, then we're going to have everything. We're going to have everything potentially there on the table for us to deal with.
I told you it was going to be provocative, and I'm sure there will be more questions than following in the Q&A session. But let's move on to the second presenter, Taka Miyaguchi. Taka is director of the Career Center of Associate Professor of Kyoto University of Foreign Studies in Japan. His recent research topics include the realist approach and critical realism, and how they are applied to evaluation, especially to climate change interventions. Before joining the academia, Taka worked at the UN system for 8 years, primarily at UNDP, developing climate change projects through Jeff funding. Taka holds a PhD in global environmental studies, and he's going to talk about now the importance of theory-based evaluation in our attempt to evaluating sustainable development, suggesting certain theoretical frameworks and methodologies to be used in evaluation at the nexus between the human and natural system. So Taka, you have the floor.
Right, okay, right, thank you so much. My name is Taka, thank you for your kind introduction. And whenever I'm given this type of a precious opportunity to talk, what I need to think is what not to talk, and I cross out many other things. So the slides you have, but the slide that I have is a little bit different, so I'm going to just try to skip a lot. Yeah, my title is the importance of the utilization of theory-based evaluations in the context of sustainable development, and it's actually great that I am actually talking after Andy has laid out the many important conceptual background on to this presentation, hopefully. Okay, so okay, this is a slide I'm going to skip. Yes. Then the left half, I'm going to skip. Okay. It's going to be fast. See, I'm collectivist here. Okay. So, okay, going to the third point here, that of course it is difficult, definitely, to evaluate sustainable development, but listening to all the inspiring discussions and presentations of all the people in this conference, of course, I do feel that the definition of, for example, sustainability, definition of transformation, definition of sustainable development are all different. But the area, or let's say that how I want to narrow down in terms of definition of a sustainable development I would like to use in this presentation is, again, at the nexus. So at the nexus between the human and natural systems. So this narrower definition or evaluation may not be applicable to many other thematic foci that I have to say. But for example, coming from that difficulty, one of the very famous and not the popular, but famous difficulty is the aggregation challenge. So to say the micro-macro paradox. But if we look at the complex system and what that tells us, it's that kind of typical phenomenon where even the summation of parts will not be necessary for us to understand the whole. So that's the typical complex system phenomena, and that's why we are very much struggling, because we are trying to really add up the parts in order for us to explain the whole, which we actually cannot if the system is complex. And second, that's this one here. There are 2 points. One is that, as Andy was saying, the evaluation practice itself is heavily social science driven. And even though somewhat we do see some of the natural science driven, so to say, evaluation, but it's actually the either. So that's my first point. So it's either in social science or the biophysical or natural science, either. That's first point. That's a tendency. Although the social science drivenness, so to say, or the concentration is heavier Okay, that's my first point. Second, even though there are some disciplines or the scholars who do try to look at the influence from nature to human system, they look at in one way. So more like a street, one-way street, really. So either from nature to human or from human to nature only, and not two ways. So 2 points I would like to make here again is either social or natural science driven or one way, and rarely two ways. And that's precisely this at the nexus or the two evaluand concept that it entails. And also this connects to the reductionism that I am very much fan, not necessarily the person who understood the whole this philosophy or science called the critical realism. I'm very much looking forward to the presentation on that. But one, for example, the Roy Baska, who has developed a concept of critical realism, he talked about a lot about reductionism. For example, climate change. In his book on interdisciplinarity of climate change, he talked about how the complex phenomenon called climate change has been boiled down to the number, which is CO2 equivalent number. So that's very much the example of reductionism. At the same time, I was quite heartened to hear, for example, from Joe's systematic review on the forest conservation, that although there are many interesting studies with quasi-experience and whatnot have been done for the forest conservation, but very few of those cases looked up non-forest element of environment and also livelihood element. So that tells us that this is, so to say, the reductionism type of thing. Of course, us as a social scientist or natural scientist, we do need to narrow down the scope in order to increase the level of plausibility or the logic itself, but here goes the trade-off. And also the sustainable development itself is the complicated and the complex, both are being entailed. So that's the thing. So on and on, from this slide, what I wanted to say is that it is quite difficult to evaluate SD at the nexus especially, right? And this is coming from critical realism, but if there's one slide that I would like to have about critical realism is this 4 modes of inference. 2 modes of inference is what we know definitely, a deduction and induction. A deduction coming from a theory that should be universally applied to the reality, and induction is that the distilled, so to say, a theory coming up from the field or cases, so that this distilled inducted theory should be applicable to others as well. So that's a deduction and induction. But if we end at this level, then this leaves us with this, what works. But what's great about critical realism, the usefulness of this is that it goes beyond that, further suggesting or emphasizing the 2 extra modes of inference. One is abduction. It's a little bit of a dangerous word, but abduction is the is what social scientists do. Actually, they do that. Yes. What may work for whom and how. And this is specifically why the theory-based evaluation is based on a philosophy of science called critical realism. Of course, many scholars does argue against it, but I do believe that the theory-based evaluation has a foundation of critical realism, because under these theory-based evaluations, they will hypothesize and estimate what may work for whom and how. And if we end at this point, if we end with abduction, then we are not going to the depth or the essence of critical realism. The gist and essence of critical realism is the last one, the 4th one, which is retroduction is called. And that's, I just want to read, but to reconstruct the basic conditions of these phenomena to be what they are. So this is actually domain of real, if you're familiar with critical realism. But in what circumstances are we talking about the certain a mechanism to be triggered so that it will work? So that it will work. Okay, so that's 4 modes of inferences are important. and especially coming from the critical realism. Okay, so realist. Yes. Okay. So, having said that, as we know that, for example, Paulson and Tilly, who is advocate of realist approach and realist evaluation, how they developed the realist approach. This is according to my opinion, but it's more applicable to deliver more precise and substantive program learning, but it can deal less well with highly complex multi-site interventions with multiple outcomes. Although the critical realism itself is a philosophy of science that very much helps us to understand more smoothly what this complex system behaves and not, but the realist approach, which is adapted version of critical realism in evaluation practice, helps more to deciphering, so to say, more concise and substantive program learning, rather than the second, rather than the theory of change or program theory. If you're coming from the Carol Weiss, then that's theory of change. If you're coming from Fun and Rogers, that's program theory, interchangeably. But theory of change is more concerned with the overall program outcome. Thereby, it helps to provide a strategic perspective on a complex program. So many, of course, tools that we have in a theory-based evaluations, but depending on the evaluand, again, we do need to be careful in selecting the tool, even from that theory-based evaluation. And this next slide, 80% I'm gonna skip, but there's one paper, interesting paper, which is all shown here. This is second from Coring and et al. But definitely, as Andy was saying, definitely there is an over-reliance of social scientists, especially when we look at the theory-based evaluations. This paper is quite interesting, looking at all the filtered and selected theory-based evaluation cases, and they looked at how the methodologies and how the program theories were constructed. 5 minutes, yeah, based on which approach. Yeah? So over-reliance social scientists, definitely there is. And this actually, the author even states that the evaluators in these theory-based evaluation cases are not even evaluators. They, according to the paper, they are social scientists wanting to validate his or her own or a disciplinary theory. So it's very much of a their own thing. Yeah. So coming back to the initial point that I made, that it's a social scientist or natural science. But in this case, theory-based evaluation and the practice of evaluation can definitely be said to be heavily dominated by social scientists. I'm not saying this is a wrong thing, by the way. I'm just saying this is what's being discovered. Okay, don't shoot me. Okay, right. So, right. Then, looking at this evaluand, two evaluand or at the nexus, what I personally think is that these two theories or theoretical framework will be of our reference. One is SES, social ecological system, and also it's actually stemmed from SES, but its acronym is CHANS, but the coupled human and natural systems. And this CHANS, especially coupled human and natural systems, this is inspired from the famous Elinor Ostrom adaptive management research. Then the applications in CHANS, coupled human and natural systems, they are now beyond common pool resources, because Elinor Ostrom's research has been sometimes criticized because they only look at those small communities facing the commons, the common pool resources, and how they, the socio-economic entity, how they can adapt to the status of ecological status in front of them. So the gist of this adaptive management governance model is that how the social economic entity, social entity, can change their own decision-making precision and whatnot according to the changing status of the ecological system, and vice versa. So there's the feedback, so to say. So that's the gist of it. But this type of theoretical framework will be, I feel, of our great reference. For example, this, I'm not going to get into the details, but this framework is what was proposed from Eleanor Ostrom and similar adaptive management researchers. The yellow highlighted ones are the 5 large subsystems that they call it to frame these interactions between the human and nature. And green ones are the ones that this is based on the case studies. These green highlighted ones are the vital sub-components through which that we may be able to see the self-organization of those communities to be responding to the changing ecological status. But either case, what I want to say from here is that this one, that it's very important to focus on a context under a common theoretical framework. So this goes to the importance of model system, that yes, we be able to actually find as many cases as possible, but this I quote from Ostrom, but without a framework like this, isolated knowledge from studies, case studies, is not likely to accumulate. So we will have to look at that system as a complex system, theoretical framework, and through which we should be guided in looking or picking up the important elements from the cases. Right. Then 1 minute. Okay. All right. So chance is important. Next. Okay. So this is the common elements coming from the coupled human and natural systems. And almost all these elements are actually said by Andy. And these are all resonate with the elements of evaluating SD at the nexus. Okay. So this is just an example how the chance system actually do function or not. And animation doesn't work, so I do have one slide, but anyhow, okay. This can be my last slide. That appropriate methodologies for evaluating sustainable development, is it out? Okay. So theory-based evaluations based on coupled human and natural system framework. The recommended methodologies are as follows. First is triangulation. Interestingly, although triangulation with mixed methods is almost like a jargon, everyone says it if you're in an evaluation community, but that's what is promoted and focused in even in a complex system, because we will not be able to judgmentally prove. So more and more we will be required to rely on a triangulation and a mixed method. That's first. Second is a more reliance on a nested layered theory of change. We do need to start relying on that too. And the causal inferences, again, this is typical theory-based evaluations if you're an evaluator, but this is very much happening in social science, natural science as well, biophysical science as well, like emerging infectious disease research as well. And the fourth, this is actually coming from Weiss. Usage of meta-analysis is, if we want to utilize more on a theory-based evaluations, we will be required to look more into the meta-analysis rather than looking at the single studies. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Taka. And thank you for sticking to the time limit. Any question for clarification for Taka? Great. So it looks like you did a great job.
Can I just offer an opportunity?
Andy has a question.
In the Chan's photographs you had there, you had the work they did with pandas in China, right? So it'd be really useful, because people don't understand complex systems and all the thresholds. I think it'd be useful just to describe that briefly.
Okay. This is one example coming from coupled human and natural system chance. Again, this is coming from the Eleanor Ostrom, but it's a little bit more expanded. That I am a natural science trained from Michigan, but I'm regrettably say that these excellent scholars are from Michigan State, but these these Jack Liu and colleagues have been researching that, for example, the excellent book that I can definitely recommend is The Panda and the People and the Pandas. Okay, and they looked into the national parks and, for example, preservation of tigers in Nepal, and also the panda-related conservation in Ulon National Reserve in China, and how these two, even though they are very different, they call it telecoupling, but very different distance, but they do share very many commonalities, especially coming from the interactions perspective, how the community, for example, and local resident, how they interact in the human subsystem, and at the same time, if you look at the natural subsystem, interaction between land cover and wildlife. But what's the gist of this chance or this theoretical framework is that the human nature interactions. It is not the one way, it's not either or, but the interactions. But to disappoint you a little bit, if you read the papers, etc., they are narratives. So they're not going to give us the answer. Of course, if you're looking for the answers, then they're not going to give you one. It's a narrative, it's a heuristic tool, as I said. But based on that theoretical framework, through which we, the evaluators, should be looking into what are things that we should be looking at. Instead of, without having any theoretical framework like this, then we may be just looking, collecting all the cases and trying to come up with inductive ones. Maybe this is a theory that is applicable, these things, okay? But we will never know, okay? So my point here is that we should be looking more on a chance-related theoretical framework if we are looking at the nexus, okay?
Thank you, Taka. Let's move to the third presenter, Callum Murdoch. Callum has a private finance background, having worked with hedge funds at a leading investment bank for several years before joining LTS International. Several long-running multi-project development finance programs in the low-carbon development sector. These include the UK government's Climate Public-Private Partnership Programme, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation Renewable Energy Portfolio Meta Evaluation, and the UK government's Carbon Market Finance Programme. Again, sorry. Callum has a MS degree in International Law and Sustainable Development, and he will introduce a case study on how he used realist synthesis to overcome evaluation challenges in the uncertain landscape of carbon finance. His presentation will introduce the different methodological approaches chosen for overcoming these challenges. Callum, sorry.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I'll probably stand. So before I begin, I just want to say, so originally I was meant to be presenting this with my colleague, Lisa Kepler from a Repo Consult. So unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it here this week, but her slides did, which is good. So I'm going to kind of talk through those today. So where do we point this? Down here? There. So the program I'm going to talk a bit about today is the UK government's Carbon Market Finance Programme, which is run through one of the World Bank trust funds called the Carbon Initiative for Development. And I guess before I go too far into the program itself, I maybe ask how many people in the room are familiar or understand the systems behind carbon emission reduction certificates? Just by a rough show of hands. Great, looks like a lot of people. Perfect, well, so the program in question was designed to be a bit of a proof of concept of the idea of using results-based finance agreements centered around emission reduction certificates through the CDM. And that was supported, so that was through what they called the Carbon Fund, and that was supported by business development support through what they called the Readiness Fund. And so the program was implemented, generating a portfolio of 12 projects, all focused on energy access or clean energy projects across Africa. And as you can see from our timeline at the bottom here, so LTS and our partners, we started this evaluation actually at the end of 2014, and we will be running the evaluation all the way until probably 2025 by the time that final evaluation is complete. So it's a long time to be kind of involved in the program. And so this year we've just done our midterm evaluation, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So I wanted to touch a bit on some of the challenges just as soon as we set out on evaluating this program. And it kind of feeds into to what Andy and Taka were talking about, which is we're dealing with this kind of multi-level transformation approach. We have these 12 projects, 12 pilot projects, all working in very different contexts, very different technologies, in kind of these local energy access markets. And then we have this program level transformation of the carbon market, of how people view carbon finance. And one of the biggest problems for that is, at the moment, this program is tied to the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, and nobody really knows what's going to happen to that in a year's time. I would say about 80% of the people that we've spoken to this year have told us it will die, it will go, it will be gone. And 20% of people are holding out hope that it will continue or something very similar to it will go forward. But there's this real uncertainty between all the big players that we've spoken to in the carbon market about what's going to happen over even the next 2 years. The other problem that I'll just highlight here is the limited data availability and this idea of confidentiality. So anyone who came to the impact investing panel yesterday, we talked a bit about this, about the idea that it's very difficult to evaluate these projects that are private sector driven, that are really kind of market driven, because nobody wants to tell you their secrets. Nobody wants to tell you their business modeling, or some do. Some are very forward, but there's a lot of kind of confidential information and commercial sensitivity. So, given the kind of challenging environment that we were dealing with, and the different tiers to the program, the different levels of potential for impact, we chose to implement a realist evaluation framework. So I think everyone's heard this kind of statement now at some point over the past couple of days, but realist evaluation, so how and why does the project work, for whom, and very importantly, in what circumstances. So we worked collaboratively with our client and with the implementing body at the World Bank, with CDEV, to establish our realist evaluation, our framework based on the ICMOs, which I'll come on to in a minute. And we supported that with a very mixed methods approach. This is kind of a selection of things that we've done this year, case studies built around a theory of no change, contribution analysis, benchmarking, and so on. So really a very diverse kind of collection of analyses. I think hopefully most people are familiar with the context mechanism outcome, the CMO approach, but I'll just kind of highlight it here. So this is what we were looking at. We were looking at what was the intervention in question, in what context was it operating, and what was the mechanism of change that it hoped to trigger. So I do want to talk a little bit about the development cycle for those ICMOs. One of the biggest challenges we had was we were looking at this from a program portfolio level. We were trying to create hypotheses that fit all of these very different projects and fit the program portfolio. And so one of the things that we really did was this full cycle of developing our hypotheses, testing them, and refining them with our client, with key stakeholders. And when we submitted our preliminary findings in May, we took the opportunity to revise them completely, almost. And then we went back through and we tested all of our evidence against the revised statements. And now we're submitting the report and we're getting ready to go through that process again. So just very quickly, we came up with 4 ICMO statements to guide our evaluation, and they can be split into 2 groups. So the first 2 on the list there are about the direct results of the program. You know, how many carbon credits were generated, what development benefits and co-benefits of the investments were there. Really looking at kind of tangible results that we could talk about. The second 2, ICMO 3 and 4, were more impact level. They were a bit more intangible. They were a bit more qualitative. We were looking at barrier removal for local energy access markets. Had these markets been improved as a result of the interventions of the program? And ICMO 4, market transformation and replication in the carbon markets. Is anybody trying to replicate this approach in a system where the kind of core framework that the approach is held to is slowly coming to an end? I mean, I think we can guess the answer to that now, but that was what we were looking at. And then in our analysis of the ICMOs, so we took a really robust approach to coding. It's a very enjoyable summer with a lot of big Excel spreadsheets working our way through. But we looked, first of all, how strongly did the evidence support the ICMO? And that was the evidence on its own, irrespective of anything else that would influence that. We looked at how plausible or verifiable the evidence was, a bit about the kind of quality or the strength of that evidence. And then we looked at the convergence of that data. And this is where we had some of the bigger challenges, I think, in our coding. But we looked to see how many positive, how many negative pieces of evidence we had. So very quickly, a couple of slides on some of the other approaches that we use to generate evidence for our ICMOs, for our realist approach. The first is a market barrier analysis or theory of no change analysis that built on an exercise that we had done as part of our first formative evaluation a few years previously. So with the market barrier analysis, we looked at 4 kind of different categories of where barriers would occur in energy access markets. So we looked at the barriers that were affecting the users, the beneficiaries. We looked at the barriers that were affecting the processes by which the technologies were reaching the users and beneficiaries in the supply chain. We looked at barriers in financing, for local financing mainly, but financing. And we looked at barriers in policy. And you can see, you know, there's some replication across there. I think almost everyone struggles with affordability or cost effectiveness in some form. This year, during the midterm evaluation, we were fortunate enough to visit half of the portfolio. So we managed to visit 6 out of the 12 projects in total. And we were able to do kind of a more in-depth evaluation of the barriers affecting those projects and how the program was potentially addressing them. What we found, I suppose our report isn't finished yet, but tipping our hat a bit, what we found was that these projects on the ground, 5 minutes, that's fine. What we found was these projects on the ground were really effective at addressing user side and supply chain barriers. And that's because they were market-driven programs. Half of them were led by private sector companies, half of them led by the public sector, pretending to be the private sector, but in all cases, very concerned with their own commercial profitability. And so, of course, they were just really very focused on getting their product to the market. they were far less concerned with more systemic market issues affecting the policy conditions or working with local financiers. The vast majority of projects that we've looked at are far more interested in applying for grants. A term that one of our consultants suggested was that they were grantrepreneurs rather than entrepreneurs, that they were really just looking for that international finance. So the other thing that we did with these case studies was to have a look at contribution analysis. This is still an ongoing analysis that we're looking at. But really this addresses something that I've spoken about a bit so far, or yesterday I spoke about, the challenge with attribution in these types of programs. The intervention is really that they're getting finance if they successfully sell their products and generate these certificates. It's very hard to attribute that to the wider market changes. So we've been using contribution analysis to really kind of understand some of the ways that that may or may not have happened. So I think this slide speaks for itself a little bit, but we were running it's a theory-based evaluation, and our client at the UK government have their theory about what the program is, and the co-donors have their theory about what the program is. I'm desperately trying to get into that box. You know, the program implementers, they have their own theory. The project entities themselves have their own business models, their own theories, and then we as evaluators have our own theory about how it works or how it should work. And case in point for that, I talked about having this carbon fund and this readiness fund. These two very distinct interventions. One is the agreement to provide results-based financing, and that stands alone. The other is business development and capacity support. I don't know about people in the room. To me, those are very different interventions and are going to trigger very, very different mechanisms. To others in the program, they're not, because you cannot have one without the other. Only carbon-funded projects get access to readiness support. But it's just this really interesting area where even at the very first step of the program theory, we have hugely different opinions on it. So I'll wrap up with this. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Doing okay? Okay, good. Perfect. So I'll wrap up with this, just a bit of a piece on some of the challenges that we had applying realist evaluation in this context. So the first thing we found was that ICMOs, I think that they're a really useful way to frame a hypothesis and a really useful way to break down program theory. They can be really constraining. There is a real risk that if you set the wrong ICMO at the start of the program or the start of the evaluation, that you're locked into the wrong analysis going forward. Now, we were very lucky that we had a lot of opportunities to engage with our client, to engage with our implementing partners, and to revise those ICMOs as we went along. But that is one of the risks that we saw. They also might appear too linear, too simplistic in very complex contexts. If I could go back to the start of this evaluation and I could really spend more time on the development of these ICMOs, I would probably spend time developing them maybe for each of the projects and then trying to aggregate at a portfolio level. Problem is a dozen projects is a really awkward number. It's not few enough that it's time efficient to do ICMOs for each project. But it's also too many and in too diverse a context to have properly generalizable ICMOs at the portfolio level. So saturation of evidence feeds into this. So I talked about the idea of looking at the convergence of data for positive and negative coding on the scoring. So when you have 6 projects that are doing really well and 6 projects that are not doing so well, convergence of data at the portfolio level is almost impossible to achieve. And I think we probably realized that a little bit too late, but it is something that we're now looking at. It's given us a new way to kind of analyze the data, which is interesting. But I think that with this kind of smaller portfolio, it's hard to achieve that saturation. So case studies, just, yeah, as I said, we saw 6, but that's only half of our portfolio. And some of those projects are doing are kind of right at the top end of the portfolio, and at least one of them is at the very, very bottom end of performance. So we had this real kind of extreme bias of evidence in our coding that we needed to manage carefully in the way that we collected data for the other programs. Limited availability of external literature, so this comes back to that idea of kind of confidentiality. People want to retain their secrets, but there's also just not a lot of people doing results-based carbon financing anymore. It's hit a real lull. You know, the market has gone very far down, and nobody really wants to start because they don't know what's going to happen in 2 years' time. So it's been quite difficult benchmarking the fund for this program against others that might be doing similar interventions. And then at the end here, yeah, we just have about value for money and benchmarking. So the program, and this is where I'll finish, but the program has been really bad for resetting objectives, resetting targets as it goes along. It's been running for 5 years now. I believe in that time it has had 4 log frames. And the current log frame is still not finalized. And this is not just a change of kind of the milestones within indicators, this has been a complete change of the indicators on the log frame, including very nicely recently the addition of a commitment within their log frame to work better with us, the evaluators, which I appreciate, but it maybe tells you a bit about how things were in the previous few years. So I think that this has been really hard for us to then look back and say, how was this value for money? How do we measure the program when they keep kind of changing their own targets? And I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Callum. Very quickly, any question for clarification? Yes, Joe.
Very quick question, Callum. Thank you, Carlo. Could you talk a little bit about the data that you collected and what you refer to as the evidence? And how you organized it?
Very quickly, huh?
Yeah, so the data really ranged, a huge amount of interviews. We've got far more kind of key informant interviews than we had expected to get. Huge amounts of trustee documents from the implementing partner and from the projects themselves. So we had kind of this mix, interesting mix of qualitative and quantitative. We had a lot of very hard factual evidence in terms of what was coming out of the CDM, in terms of the verification reports and the CERs that were issued, and we could really track results very clearly. In terms of how we organized it and how we used it, probably more rigorously than we needed to would be the response to that. We went through and did really, really detailed qualitative coding. So for every interview, we would extract every kind of interesting data point that related to our ICMO, and we would code that in its own right, separate from everything else. So it did mean that our kind of level of effort spent on coding each particular piece of evidence was perhaps higher than it needed to be. But what it has given us now is this amazing sense of traceability. So where we have the likelihood that there'll be a lot of pushback on some of our findings and we'll need to really justify what we're saying, we can go back and point to each individual piece of evidence very clearly that has led to a finding.
Move to the next presenter, Joe Puri. You just asked a question. Jo is the head of the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. She has 23 years experience in evaluating research in agriculture, environment, health, and infrastructure-related poverty alleviation. Jo has worked for the World Bank, UNDP, UNEP, and 3IE, the International Initiative on Impact Evaluation, and she has published several books and written extensively. She is also adjunct associate professor at the School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University, USA, and research fellow at the Center for Evaluation and Development. Jo has a PhD and an MSc in Agriculture and Resource Economics and an MSc in Development Economics. She will present a learning paper in which the IEU of the Green Climate Fund investigated the question of complexity and science of complex systems in climate change interventions and its influence on program and project evaluation in climate change and finance. So you have the floor, Jo.
Thank you so much, Carlo. Yeah, this is actually a really interestingly curated session because I think that I don't know whether it was meant to be, but I'm really thankful to Carla for ensuring that we all sort of came together in some chaotic way, but we did. And what I want to reflect on, and I think it stitches itself very nicely with what Andy presented and then what Taka presented as well, is that when I joined the Green Climate Fund about 2.5 years ago, we started to think about this human and natural system interaction in a far more intentional way than I had been in my previous life. Primarily because we were working at the Green Climate Fund, and as the evaluation office, we needed to think about the interaction of these two systems. And of course, we needed to think about complexity. But how did that get translated into what we were doing as the evaluation office? And I'm not going to go into the existential challenges that threw up for us, and I'm sure that's the content of many other discussions. But what I want to talk about now is two things. One, we started to look at complexity, and this is a young colleague of mine and I, we ended up exploring complexity from a variety of other disciplines, but we focused on other disciplines, realized that the way evaluations and evaluators tend to look at complexity was quite simplistic because we want to finally get it down to understandable linear or even non-linear pathways, but things that we can put in two-dimensional spaces. That was one. And second, we realized that although we wanted to move away from what evaluators and economists, because I'm an economist, tended to understand from our complexity, we still hadn't gone. And this presentation will show you, we're still at literally the tip of the iceberg, of a very, very big iceberg in terms of understanding complexity ourselves. And so we are doing further work in this space, and we are going and speaking to mathematicians and physics experts, etc. And that's the next generation of this work. So I'll present that next time when I'm here. But for now, I'm going to show very quickly what we did in complexity and how that then influenced the way we are doing some of our own evaluation work and evaluation practice, mainly to use this forum to also get your feedback, your thoughts, and make it much more interactive. So with that in mind, I know most of you know complexity, but I still want to put it out there. What is this? Anyone? I can keep waiting till someone answers. Ants, right? So ants work together despite not having a leader telling them what to do. Yeah, I say this to my team, but of course I say that the IU definitely needs a leader. And everything else, yeah. Yeah, that's definitely another topic. But essentially, they work with decentralized signaling, and that's something I do encourage, of course. And there's self-organization. So there's one attribute of complex systems, which is decentralized signaling and self-organization. But they also change their behavior based on what they see others doing, right? And so this is adaptive interaction. And this is also something that we have to deal with as evaluators, but also as program implementers. And the last thing is that the whole, these are fire ants, they are greater than the sum of its parts, and Andy referred to this, and so did Taka. And this is the concept of emergence, right? That the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But using this, then we wanted to understand, well, what is happening with GCF investments? GCF investments currently total about $5.3 billion in climate change, right? And they started only 4 years ago, depending on how you start to count. But basically, if in $5.3 billion, how are we dealing with the idea that these projects should be valuable, should be able to respond to the big question of what's happening to climate, but also to human interactions? And how are they emerging in some sort of a complex system? So the fundamental characteristic of complex systems is really this emergence property, which really resonated with us, and things that arise through interactions, right? And we see this in different parts of our lives and at different levels. If you go from a cell to an organism, or take a water molecule and see that the properties of a water molecule, actually water molecules don't have any fluidity. But then you put lots of water molecules together and then there's liquid and then they have fluidity. So even the attributes, it's not just the outcome that is emergent, but the attribute itself is emergent, right? And that's what Eleanor Ostrom, and this is what Taka referred to as well, basically did when she organized or tried to understand local systems through the lens of complexity. And I liked Andy's word for it. Vantage point? No, what was it? Stance. Yeah. So I really like that point. And I keep thinking of this, that as the evaluator, what is our lens? And can we be really upfront and open about what our lens or stance is? I won't go over this, but just to essentially identify that, of course, many differences between complicated and complex, and both things, complicated and complex systems, have some things in common. They have moving parts, they are multiple, they work together in a network to produce an outcome, etc. But complex systems adapt and communicate, and like I said, agents communicate in a decentralized way, which is really important to recognize. And there is this potential for unpredictable behavior, which is then makes it very different from what is complicated, right? So in the context of where we are working, clearly most of our investments are essentially working in complex systems, but we are working across multiple dimensions, and this is the human and natural systems. Nexus that we are working in, and we're trying to understand whether, well, our investments are working. But there's one other lens or stance that I want to be really open about, and that is that I definitely have espoused this idea of realist evaluation, where we want to think about how things change, whether programs are working or not, or whether investments are working or not, how they are working, for whom, under what circumstances. But there's one other element that I'm really always concerned about, and that is how much, right? So with all of the questions that realist evaluation forces us to ask, which is how much, sorry, I beg your pardon, how, why, under what circumstances, and for whom, I'm constantly asking the other question as well, which is how much, because finally, we want to try and answer that question, whether we like it or not. So given all of that, we are acknowledging that, of course, complex systems have all of these attributes. And then they have this other attribute of, unpredictable changes and tipping points. Related very much to the extinction point that was made earlier, that is that inaction will lead to an ecological collapse. And so there is this other sense of urgency and time dimension as well that we have to deal with as we go along. So what we started off was at a very, very basic level. Can we measure complexity in climate change projects and climate change investments? And what does it mean for evaluation, for our evaluation practice? And just to, spoiler alert, we haven't found the answer yet, but I'm taking you on my journey, okay? So what we did, we basically then looked at 10 big investments that the GCF had made, and I'm going to essentially give you the aggregate result here. We looked at evaluability, complexity, proposed evaluation designs, all of their projects, and we started off at the beginning with just a desk study. But one of the things that the evaluability study, and I presented this actually at a very small group session where Andy was there as well, and where we talked about the evaluability of GCF investments. And we found essentially that you couldn't say anything about how evaluable they were right at the beginning. I mean, 65% of them didn't even think of about a baseline. 90% of them did not have a theory of change. And these were things that we were realizing right at the beginning. And we were taking these to the board, right? But with all of this, we were also thinking about complexity. And then we created a rubric to rate levels of complexity. To understand, well, low, medium, high. Can we say something about whether these are very complex, whether these are, well, complex, but at a low level, and does that mean anything for us in the evaluation practice? And then we also did a review of complexity literature, albeit at that time only within the evaluation and the economics literature, and since then we've basically found out a huge lot more. Okay, so what we found basically that in the programs, in the $5 billion essentially, which has been put out by the GCF, if you just looked at theories of change, program theories of change, and this is the lens that we used, we found that, well, either they were absent or they were weak. This was not surprising, but the extent of it was. The fact that we, that in 92% of the projects that we didn't see strong theories of change, and in most of them, as many projects, we didn't see any thinking about understanding what point of time projects were starting off from, and some measurement of that was surprising. A lot of confounding, even though a lot of projects, and I do think that in natural sciences, this discipline of understanding and measurement of how much the changes is far stronger than we like to think. Despite that, a lot of that science had not been incorporated into the understanding of contexts and mechanisms that these projects reflected. And we found that when we used the rubric, and I'll show you that rubric very quickly, mitigation projects, so projects that were examining how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, tended to be far less complex than adaptation projects. Yeah, and that's primarily because of the nexus question. They tended to be located at the nexus far more, adaptation projects did, compared to mitigation projects. And then when the one additional dimension that we are still struggling to look at is the institutional and policy dimension of a lot of the work that the GCF is doing. And this is essentially, trying to understand, well, how even within the human dimension, GCF investments might be thinking about policy. So the rubric that we used was something very simple, and we realized we had to start with something very simple that we could then use to apply to the projects that we looked at. We looked at the quality of theory of change, the types of interventions and the numbers of interventions we could identify, groups of stakeholders and the types of stakeholders that they were working with, the sectors that these projects were going across, and the numbers of sectors, and the outcomes. So whether these were mitigation, adaptation, cross-cutting, etc. And we had much more granularity in this, but just at an aggregate level, this is actually, one version of this has also been done, I think, elsewhere. So we tweaked a framework that we had seen before, but we basically used it and we tweaked it to the context of GCF projects. Okay. And then we created our rating. So I don't want you to read the fine print, which is why it's there in fine print. And it's essentially saying that, yeah, we, for the 10 projects that we looked at, we created this, this ranking. And then we started to think about, well, what does it mean? So they went between low to medium to high. And these were projects that were in Peru, Bangladesh, Gambia, Vietnam, Chile, Pakistan, Madagascar, Vanuatu, and 2 small island developing states. So yeah, we had all of these, high, low, medium ratings of complexity. But we were also constrained by the fact that we were using proxies in many cases, right? And this sort of goes back to the realist evaluation sort of discussion that we are having here. To what extent can we go beyond proxies, and can we start to think about, well, what is truly happening in case studies? And that's why my question to Callum as well. Okay, So then just to give you one example of how this translated into some of the work that we are doing within the independent evaluation unit. This is a photograph, oh, done. I was really hoping it would work. So this is actually a very nice video of the project in Madagascar showing you, different tree species, etc., and how dense it is, and then the people there as well. And so essentially the human and nature nexus that I wanted to display. But essentially, sorry, okay, I don't know what happened. Okay, well, clearly the voices are there, but not the pictures. So then we translated this into what is basically called a learning-oriented real-time impact assessment program, which is what the IU is currently leading. Yeah, and this is a multi-year program where we are working with projects on the ground. And this one example is of sustainable landscapes in Madagascar, where the program itself is a collaboration between the private and the public sector, which is Conservation International and the European Investment Bank. And essentially, the program is looking at building sustainable landscapes in forest corridors in Madagascar, and trying to understand as to how we can do better and build in evaluation as it goes along. So because I have only 1 minute, as Kate tells me, I'm not going to go over the objectives, but I do want to go over what we are doing essentially with the program, right? So keeping in mind the 5 things, we want to understand how, why, for whom and under what circumstances, but also how much these investments are making a difference, and keeping in mind also the objectives of the investment, which is increasing resilience and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this is essentially a project that's going from 2018 to 2027. So we basically got armed with a lot of GIS data beforehand, which is time series data, and which basically goes from the 1950s and now on land use, on climate hazard, on environmental deforestation, on food security and food shortages, as well as administrative data. So we got a lot of that as well before we essentially went into the field. But then we spent last year, I was there with the team, and then the team is down there again. And we are working very closely with the University of Mannheim. But we have basically now set up a system where we are working with forest user groups to understand how training distribution and livelihood interventions are working. But then we've essentially, what we've done is we've organized the interventions as well as the data collection in different phases in a way that is integrated for the initiative on the ground. And the interesting thing for us is that it's met with a lot of support from the project, because it's learning oriented and it's really helping them think about results and adaptive management. So as we went along that, essentially what apologies for this slide, I think I'm going to finish with my last slide, recognizing that outcomes are emergent properties of complex systems, as we know, and to really build adaptive experimentation. Clearly, one way to think about this strategically for multilateral funds is to think about results-based payments, where you are sitting in Songdo or South Korea or Washington, D.C. or Nairobi, and you could be working with teams on the ground that have the expertise to implement as well as adaptively change as they go along, while predicating payments on results. Because you're then combining, in a very nice way, expertise on the ground with resources. Carlo will not let me go through my last slide, but essentially, yeah, we are essentially taking this forward and using a very data-intensive approach as we espouse learning-oriented real-time impact assessment and think about understanding complex systems. Happy to chat more. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. So we should stop the session here because it's noon now, but I just checked with Senia, my colleague. It looks like there's nothing in the room afterwards, so I hope we can get advantage of this situation. Any question for clarification for Joe? Can you introduce yourself first?
Thank you. I'm Susan Legros. I'm a consultant who works on climate change projects. And my question was, it's a request, if you could talk a little bit more about your thinking on measuring institutional and policy interventions, and then also whether you'll be using the same approach for your investment projects versus the readiness funding program.
Can I just do that without a mic? It's a quick answer. So, thank you. Actually, on measuring institutional and policy, we are devising a protocol right now. We haven't gotten to that, but in an earlier work and in my earlier life, we had started to look at far more diffuse interventions, especially those around advocacy. So we've done, also an evidence review and a review of methodologies, and we sort of come up with a basic protocol to look at very diffuse sorts of interventions. And the idea is that we want to try and see as to how we can use that.